All right. We were gonna we were talking a little bit about population and the Columbian Exchange. Y'all ever heard of that term, Columbian Exchange? Maybe not.
Yep.
Maybe not. Um, let's see here. There was a book by the name of the Columbian Exchange that was that came out in the '60s, I think it was, by a historian by the name of Alfred Crosby, who was a historian at the University of Texas at Austin, and it was really a groundbreaking book. It was about the exchange of biological organisms in the form of course, humans, livestock, plants, crops, diseases, and other things um, between the Old World, meaning Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the New World, meaning North America and South America, after 1492. All right, and so the Columbian Exchange refers to the uneven exchange of biological organisms and their impact after 1492. And of course, um, that process still is ongoing. We still have invasive species coming from the old world, and the old world has is impacted by species from the new world. In that book, it was well, also leading up to the Columbian 500-year anniversary of Columbus arriving in the New World back in 1992. Um, there was a lot of work done on those on trying to understand the long-term impacts of the Columbian Exchange, and from that it became pretty apparent that um, the there was a lot of it was very uneven, of course, in the exchange. Um, the Western Hemisphere, or the Americas, of course, received diseases that wiped out, in some cases, 90% of the human population. But there were other tragedies in addition to the human tragedy. And associated with the human tragedy were the introduction of livestock from the old world and the emergence of feral species and invasive species in much of the New World, particularly the Caribbean, and so the introduction of the horse into North America, the introduction of cattle and hogs, uh, which went feral, all affected the environments of the Caribbean, of Mesoamerica, of North America, and South America. And what did Europe get in exchange? Europe vastly increased its ability to feed itself by receiving things like maize, Indian corn, beans, which are native to or which were developed in Mesoamerica, the tomato, all sorts of other crops that were developed by indigenous peoples in the New World. Indigenous peoples, remember, didn't have very many livestock at all, and most of them had none. And the old world agriculture was very much dependent on livestock, and of course, the livestock were the basis of those infectious diseases that were unleashed inadvertently into the New World after 1492. So it was a very uneven exchange. On the one hand, the New World received a lot of horrible things and a lot of a lot of forced change and sort of detrimental changes, while the New World largely received beneficial changes, introductions of new food crops primarily. Um, so that Columbian exchange is ongoing, and we can, that's maybe material for another course. But we talked about the DeSoto expedition into the American South. So what I want to do now is move on to some other regions of the world. We've talked a lot about the South and about the Eastern Woodlands peoples. So I want to shift our focus just a little bit here and see if I can do this without losing. Here we go. We're going backwards. Okay, let's do this. We've talked a little bit about time spans, and this was my slide of or my sort of hand-drawn rendition of some changes taking place over time. And I'll refer back to the previous lecture about that. We talked a little bit about environmental recovery, and so here's where we want to begin today. I wanted to talk about the civilizations, the native civilizations, and their role in developing crops and their role in their experience with farming. And again, it's North America was not as rich in terms of its agricultural potential as Mesoamerica was. Mesoamerica and the Andes, with much greater population densities before 1492, had developed pretty sophisticated economies and religious beliefs, and from those economies came many of these items. But it's not to say there wasn't some domestication taking place in North America. There was. So I did mention how the Eastern Woodland, and particularly the Mississippians, were the first to receive agricultural innovations from Mesoamerica, particularly the triad, the trinity of American Indian food production, which is corn, beans, and squash, often produced in tandem with one another. So the agriculture had diffused, and agricultural crops had diffused north out of Mesoamerica, at least 1,000 years before present. So, and probably longer than that. Maize, beans, and squash also diffused to the southwest of the United States, or to the northwest of Mesoamerica. And in addition to that, they also received some crops that you're probably not so familiar with, amaranth, and of course cotton. So in the Southwest, we have there were two primary groups of native peoples who were sedentary or semi-sedentary, or at least originally were sedentary. So I want to talk about those. And so the ones closest to us in Oklahoma here are the New Mexico and southern Colorado Puebloan groups. Those are the people who live in the upper Rio Grande Valley, and they had been there for quite some time. Probably at least been there for half a millennium, 500 years prior to the arrival of Spanish conquistadors in about 1598. So these were the Pueblos, and of course the Pueblos are still around today. Puebloan groups. They lived in a sedentary, that is, they didn't migrate. They lived there. They lived in the same place all year round. They lived in a fairly communal setting. They lived in homes that were compound-like apartment buildings, in a sense. You're probably familiar with them. They had certain characteristics about them, like the ceremonial kiva, which was sort of a religiously associated structure. They farmed in the river valleys and the tributaries to the Rio Grande, the upper Rio Grande. And this region is of course in higher elevation, mostly higher elevation, which makes it fairly temperate, even though it's very dry. It doesn't get incredibly hot in the summertime, and in the wintertime it snows, and you get most of your precipitation in the wintertime. But the Puebloan peoples utilized irrigation. They they utilized rainwater irrigation. They diverted snowmelt from the smaller creeks going into in the Rio Grande drainage basin. And in fact, your textbook author, Richard Nostrand, has studied this pretty extensively in in New Mexico. Other things included, gathering of food products like pine nuts and juniper berries. These were, part of the native diet, as well as small game like jackrabbits and turkeys. A little farther west, in Arizona, in southern Arizona, is this area that we will later call the realm of the Pima, or we might call it sort of the lowland areas of the Southwest. The Pima and Papago tribes had lived there for probably at least as long, maybe a little bit longer than the Puebloan groups. They also had lived in communal adobe houses at some earlier time, but most of the signs of their sedentary life had been abandoned, and at least the ancestral peoples of the Pima and the Papago had occupied this area around the Phoenix metropolitan area today. Perhaps you've visited Casa Grande, which is one of the old ceremonial cities, and this area of southern Arizona, even though it's very agricultural today, very commercial agriculture, very intensively farmed commercially, was also an area of irrigation. So the peoples who lived in this area around the Gila and the Salt River valleys would build irrigation systems, irrigation canals that were sometimes a dozen miles or more long, and they would network the movement of that water into their fields. So it was kind of a folk engineering feat that is still being studied by people, for example, in our department here at OSU. Interestingly, when the Mormons settled in Utah, they expanded out from central Utah along the Wasatch Valley, and we'll talk about that in a different class. But the Mormons would later discover some of these irrigation systems and rehabilitate them so that they could be utilized in the late 1800s. And anyway, these are what I'm trying to get at is that the southwestern United States was actually an area where there was quite a bit of agriculture, sedentary irrigation-based agriculture, very early on. Any questions about that at this point? So we can also look at the Pacific coasts of the United States, both California and the Pacific Northwest. I've mentioned that. I've mentioned those groups. California, believe it or not, had a lot of different, very small groups of people who often were among, I hate to say it, the most primitive groups in the world, but not all of them were. In fact, you may have recall that around the turn of the 20th century, 120 years ago or so, a Native American man who had been living in sort of in isolation in the Sierras, I guess it was, sort of northern to central California. He was basically a Stone Age person who had been avoiding contact with non-Indian peoples, and he became kind of a sort of a celebrity before he died. Ever heard of Ishi? All right. Well, anyway, I believe that was his name. So in California, strangely enough, most of the tribes didn't practice agriculture. They may have grown some tobacco, but they were mostly gatherers. Some were fishermen, but they lived in a fairly non-agricultural setting in relatively small groups. Farther north, in the Pacific Northwest, around Seattle and in Portland and Vancouver and British Columbia, all the way up to Alaska. Uh, Native peoples were sedentary. They lived in one place. They lived in villages, and those villages often were, uh, you know, clusters of large communal houses that were referred to as plank houses. This northwest coast environment was so abundant in natural resources, particularly in terms of marine mammals and fish, not just marine fish, but Andromeda's fish that move upstream into the rivers. Of course, salmon is what I'm referring to here. They had a very, very highly productive environment that didn't require much agriculture. They had some house gardens and grew a few things, but most of the Pacific Northwest people were dependent on fish or on marine mammals in combination, and did very well. In fact, they had plenty of free time, as many anthropologists would later note. They had pretty complex social systems and very interesting ceremonies like the potlatch and so on. Okay, so I'm going to kind of end it there with Native Americans, and we're going to jump over to the other side of the continent and go back to go to Europe for a little bit and talk about the first Europeans that we know of that started snooping around North America. And those are the Norse people, or the Northmen. They're popularly referred to as the Vikings. Vikings, or the Norse people, had migrated by sea from eastern Scandinavia and from what is today the westernmost part of Russia, into Scandinavia, into different parts of Northern Europe. So you may know that you ever heard of where D-Day took place, right, during World War II. The coast of what? In France? Normandy, right? And Normandy was the home of the Normans, right? And the Normans conquered England in 1066, right? Well, the Normans, the term Norman actually comes from Northmen, and the Normans, the Northmen, were the descendants of Vikings who had colonized that northern coast of France, Normandy. Well, the Vikings, or the Norse, also conquered parts of England, especially northern England, and to a degree, affected the speech and genetics, I suppose, of people of that part of Great Britain. So the Vikings in places were kind of absorbed in the local culture, but some of them colonized areas that were uninhabited. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about here. The Norse began a movement of colonization that preceded the expansion of Christianity into Northern Europe. They began moving out in the 8th century, in the 700s, all the way up to the 11th century, into Scandinavia. Well, the Faroe Islands, and the Faroe Islands are, of course, right off of Great Britain, but a little farther out is Iceland, and Iceland was colonized between about the year AD 1860 and AD 930. Iceland became the base of exploration elsewhere, and so essentially around the 10th century is when the Vikings started moving out farther and farther into the north and into the west. And of course, at that high latitude, they don't have nearly as far to go to arrive at landfall in North America. Okay, but of course the Vikings were seafaring people. They weren't all warlike necessarily, but they did colonize two places in Greenland. And so from Iceland, they colonized farther west into Greenland between the years 986 AD and 1025. At that point was an interesting period of rather warm temperatures. There was a sort of a period of several, around a century or so of warmer weather that allowed agriculture to be established, believe it or not, in coastal Greenland, the southeastern coast of Greenland. The Norse also described an interesting observation around the year 1000 or so. They encountered Eskimos. They encountered basically the people of the far north who occupy the Arctic, regardless of east or west. And the Norse referred to them as the Skraelings, or just barbarians, but we're fairly certain that they were encountering Inuit people, and their encounters were not necessarily peaceful. All right, so people, there are Eskimo populations, Inuit populations in Greenland today, but there aren't that many Norse settlements anymore. So there was an east settlement and a western settlement, and from those settlements were launched, from those Greenland settlements were launched forays into the West, and from the sagas and from historical records, there are sort of unclear examples of land being described. And so Newfoundland, the large chunk of Canada that's fairly close to Greenland and Iceland by sea, was referred to as Helluland. And Markland is supposedly Nova Scotia, which we're going to be talking quite a bit about later, Acadia. And there was even, of course, you're familiar with this, if you're familiar with Leif Erikson and Eric the Red, Vinland the Good, the legend of Vinland the Good. Now, Vinland, of course, refers to a place where they can grow grapes. And so some scholars believe that it's probable that the Norse even made it as far south and southwest as New England. If they made it to Nova Scotia, probably kept going to New England. Now, these were, and there is some archaeological evidence in Newfoundland of, not evidence, settlements. There's archaeological finds of actual Norse settlements in coastal Newfoundland at this place called Les Anses Meadows. And it's just it's not very elaborate at all, but it's more of an outpost. But these Norsemen had been migrating west ahead of the expansion of Christianity into northern Europe. So they were pre-Christian Vikings, and they established very minor footholds somewhere on North America. But then, what happened to them? Nobody's really sure. Were they wiped out by Native Americans? Were they slowly integrated into Native American populations without maintaining distinctiveness? Probably. And so that's it. We want to recognize that there were early European colonizations of North America. However, the Vikings were few and far between, and they didn't establish permanent settlements that would remain distinctive. And what happened to the Vikings? What happened to the Norse? Basically, their base in Greenland became uninhabitable as global temperatures went back to normal in around 1050 AD. And so it's presumed that the Norse settlements in Greenland could no longer get foodstuffs. They certainly couldn't produce crops after global temperatures went back to more normal levels. So, of course, there are other mysteries like the presence of rune stones. If you've ever heard of the controversial sort of evidence of Viking people carving out Norse symbols on rocks and stones in North America. Probably the most more famous one was found in Minnesota by a farmer, either discovered by a farmer or manufactured by a farmer. We're not really sure whether it's true or not. But even in Oklahoma, in the east, extreme east central part of the state around Heavener, there is an area that became known as a rune stone. If you've ever visited that, it's actually a pretty cool place. The stone is the bottom of a waterfall, and whether or not the Vikings were there, most people say no, it's probably a hoax. But anyway, the presence of rune stones is just one of those things that make it more interesting, more mysterious. But from the standpoint of historical geography, the Norse were not successful. So I want to show you this. This is another one of my 5x7 card diagrams. But what it shows, I found somewhere I found a graph of, I guess it was average global temperature, and during this period, based on, this is out of ice cores out of the Antarctic, and the global temperature, this dashed line right through here is sort of the mean, or the global mean, and the red lines are according to scientific analysis of ice cores, when mean annual atmospheric temperatures were above normal, and then below normal, and above normal, and below normal. So red and blue kind of indicate above or below normal. And as we said, the Norse were colonizing the Faroe Islands and Iceland around this time, when you had these way more warmer temperatures. And then the Vikings moved out into extreme northeast North America at another one of those periods of warmer global temperatures. 986 apparently is when Eric the Red established his settlement in Greenland, and so they're working out of Greenland here, and then they start colonizing North America. But what happens? The temperatures fall again, and they never really recover big time. And you can probably guess right around here is when those Greenland settlements are in severe, dire straits. At the same time, and then of course global temperatures began to fall below average for a few centuries there after 1200. So we don't hear too much about the Vikings after that, at least not in the North Atlantic. So the Greenland settlements were somewhere between about 1000 AD, Greenland settlements about 1000 AD, and then they disappear here after about 1200 or so. And at the same time, Christianization is coming out of Scandinavia into Iceland, and eventually to Greenland. So no more Greenland settlement. Well, there are bases in Greenland today, and you can visit Greenland, of course, if on a cruise ship now. But it was not a significant permanent settlement. So probably more than you ever wanted to know about the Vikings in the North Atlantic, and long story short, is they are not really significant, and so we're not going to talk too much about the Vikings. Now, I do want to talk about other impetuses for European exploration, and so we're saying that the Greenland settlements were gone by about 1450. Another thing that's going on in the 15th century and the 14th century, of course, is Europe is beginning to reach out again. The Dark Ages or the Middle Ages are coming to an end, and the Renaissance is taking place. Somewhere between about 1300 and 1600, however you want to classify the Renaissance. And during this period, you have during the 14th to the 16th century, or the 14th to the 17th century, we have all sorts of expansion of Europeans out into the rest of the world, and the expansion of the discovery of the New World by Europeans is just part of that broader expansion. So I want everybody to be clear about that. So what's driving, I guess, what is really driving the expansion? Well, Christianity has something to do with it. The Roman Empire fell, but of course, European civilization was largely preserved by the monasteries of the Roman Catholic Church. And when we have the Renaissance coming about, you have the rediscovery of a lot of these things that had been developed in classical times. The more aggressive facet of Christianity, of course, during the Crusades, took a lot of Europeans from the continent, from Western Europe, into what they would eventually refer to as the Middle East. So the Crusades began to expand Europe and European knowledge of the rest of the world, particularly with the Middle East. And the Middle East, the Arabs were actually also preserving a lot of that classical civilization, classical technology, mathematics, algebra. They were hanging on to that, and so Europeans sort of rediscover that during this period that then lead to the great Renaissance of European culture. And at the same time that we have this expansion by Christianity, we also have an expansion of Islam after the Crusade, after the period of the Crusades, from the 1300s to the 1500s. So the Ottoman Empire expands outward. Excuse me. Ottoman Empire expands outward and creates a trade barrier for Europeans. Europeans are wanting to trade with the Far East. They, since the time of Marco Polo, they were the Silk Road, and more trade between Europe and the Far East and South Asia as well developed. But the Ottoman Empire and the ability to control that trade emerged in this period from the 1300s to the 1500s in general. So throughout that period of the Renaissance was also this period of sort of political geography interfering with trade. So jumping to the Renaissance, then the Renaissance brought about more of a scientific view of the world by Europeans. Religious authority began to be challenged, particularly challenged by people in cities, and especially the city-states of the Mediterranean Sea, like Venice and Genoa. And out of those more worldly cities, we begin to see the trade between coastal cities in the Mediterranean and coastal cities in the North Atlantic, North Sea. The social organization, or the system of social organization, the system of economies that we refer to generally as capitalism, has its origins in about the middle part of the 15th century. And geographically, capitalism, in its truest sense, really began to emerge in the Low Countries of the Netherlands and Belgium around in the middle part of the 15th century. And by by true capitalism, what we're talking about here is a place where people had the freedom to exchange, and people began to invest in activities that would bring them money. And one of those early activities, of course, was the spice trade, the trade in goods that were moving from the Far East and South Asia back to Europe. Now, of course, the movement of those goods depended on land transport. And of course, the land transport was incredibly slow and expensive. And with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, dangerous. So the spice trade was growing through this early area of capitalism in Northern Europe. Now you think of Northern Europe, the Dutch, and particularly the Dutch have long been known as sort of liberal people in a way that they were open to or they provided refuge and freedom to those people who were maybe religious dissidents. So the Dutch were able to attract people who were persecuted, but people who had some wealth, and including people like the French Calvinists, for example, and later on, the people who were persecuted by the Anglican Church in England, the Puritans. They wound up going to places like Amsterdam and being able to to live there without free of persecution by church. At this time, with the rise of capitalism, we also see the beginnings of the rise of the state, and by that I mean independent countries that are larger in scale than simply feudal feudal areas, or areas that were ruled by families, by long-standing powerful families. So as feudalism began to be challenged by more organized political states, initially city-states, we see a transformation in the ability and the need for what we can call geographic information. We begin to see more and more connections by sea between Southern Europe and Northern Europe. Southern Europe was the city-states of Southern Europe were trading with peoples all around the Mediterranean Sea and into the Middle East and Africa. And they had products that people in the northern part of Europe needed. And in the northern part of Europe, they had exports to that the Southern Europeans needed. So there began a strong connection between around Europe by sea, particularly between the northern countries and the old Hanseatic League city-states of Northern Europe, northern coast of Europe, and the city-states of Italy. There was no Italy yet, but the city-states of Southern Europe, like Genoa and Venice. And in Portugal, in Portugal, there was also an incentive to sort of work on the development of geographic information about the world. There was a man by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator, as he was referred to, who established a sort of a geographical institute at a peninsula that jutted out into the Atlantic, and this was his institute of learning, or his sort of institute for exploration. and he invited lots of mariners and other people to come to this place and share information. So information began to be shared. What was the motivation for all of this? Well, the motivation was capitalist profit. The idea that there was money to be made in trade, but in order to trade, you had to have knowledge about different places. You had to have geographical knowledge, and geographical knowledge was extremely limited at this time. So there began to be a movement to try to figure out a way to reduce the losses and the high cost of doing trade with China and India. And that's where we began to see, of course, ideas be challenged and begin to see. And by the way, before I go forward, I should say that most learned people at this time, in elementary school, I remember being taught that, and before 1492, everybody thought the world was flat, and that if you sailed too far to the west, then you would sail off the end of the earth. I remember that very clearly in my elementary school. The fact of the matter is, most people who were worldly, who lived in these well-connected cities like Genoa or Venice or northern cities like Amsterdam or Antwerp, most of the mariners, the people who understood sailing and navigation, they realized the earth was spherical, or round, as we can say, spherical, like a basketball. And how did they know that? Well, they knew it through common sense. They could see sailing ships go across, go down and disappear below the horizon in the distance. They realized that movement was subject to changes in latitude. They understood how climates differed a little bit from place to place. So it was not the idea that the Earth was flat may have been sort of a popular thing. Maybe it was sort of a vernacular idea, but for those people who had some experience with the world, they realized the world was spherical, that the globe was spherical. What was in question was the size of the Earth. Nobody really understood the size of the Earth, and I've talked a little bit about that before. So let's look at some of these mariners. And I want to focus on two mariners in particular that, of course, you know something about already. Those would be Christopher Columbus and John Cabot. Now, Columbus and Cabot were both what we would call, today we would call Italians, right? Both northern Italians. Columbus was from Genoa. He had married a woman from the Madeira Islands, she was Portuguese. So Columbus is an Italian married to a Portuguese woman. And of course, Columbus had he had been working on this idea to sail west across the ocean sea to eventually arrive at the coast of China or Japan. I'm not really sure which. So he was wanting to get to the Far East by sailing west. And on theory, this would work fine because he was working with a Ptolemaic model of the Earth's size, right? With the Ptolemaic model, as you might recall, was one in which the Earth was considered to be only about 9,000 miles in circumference at the equator. In fact, it's about 25,000 miles at the equator. So Columbus is working on a false estimate of the size of the Earth, which allows him to, deduce that it's probably very, very close to just sail west. The route was not known, but he was ready to try it. So what do you need when you want to embark on a major exploration expedition? You've got to have funding. So Columbus initially tried to get funding from the Portuguese, from Portugal, but Portugal was committed to uh, sailing and exploring the coast of Africa. So Portugal was more, Portugal was conservative to an extent. Now, at this time, the Portuguese had some some power with the Roman Catholic Church. The Portuguese were sort of were favored to a degree by the Pope, and so they were committed to going around the coast of Africa, and they didn't want to waste money on Columbus's idea that was very radical. Now, Columbus was eventually, he approached Isabella of, the monarch of Castile or the Castile and Aragon, which would eventually, form Spain, the Spanish Empire. Of course, like many other mariners, Columbus had experienced sailing all over the western and northern parts of Europe, and he was not alone. There were a lot of fishermen that also explored the North Atlantic. They got farther and farther out every year, and fishermen, of course, didn't advertise the information that they had about the North Atlantic. But Columbus was working on some of that information. He was working on this. He was working on. He was pursuing ideas that had come about from rumors. There were rumors among the fishermen, the cod fishermen of the North Atlantic, of islands out in the Atlantic. These very large islands. Some were even referred to as with names like Antilia, this island out in the middle of the Atlantic. And there were islands in the Atlantic, but most of them have been colonized by the Portuguese or the Spanish already. Well, we know what happens. Spain, in sort of competition with Portugal, funds Columbus's expedition, and of course Columbus sailed and realized that the Earth is a lot bigger than what he expected, but wound up landing in the Bahamas in 1492. And to his, at the time, of course, Columbus assumed he was in the Indies, in the East Indies, and so this is why the indigenous peoples are now referred to as the Indians. So now, when Columbus got back to Spain, Spain granted him a monopoly over his discovery, over all of what he discovered, and Spain began to be attracted to the Caribbean. Now, there was, I mentioned this rivalry between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the Pope at the time believed that, or the Pope was in favor of the Portuguese. Well, in 1494, 2 years after this, the church establishes a boundary line that runs north and south through the Atlantic, and that boundary line would divide. It was intended to give the known lands of the non-European world to the Portuguese. And so the Portuguese were granted rights to colonize and to explore everything east of this line, and the Spanish were granted whatever it was that Columbus had apparently stumbled upon out there in the ocean sea, which was assumed to be just maybe some islands. So, of course, this was bad news for the Portuguese once the hemispheres began to be understood and their actual size. Well, this by the way, do you know the name of that agreement that divided the earth between the east and the west? East for the Portuguese, west for the Spanish. the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, Treaty of Tordesillas. What the treaty line did was it cut off part of South America. The westernmost or the easternmost portion of South America was divided by that line, and that eastern part of South America then was part of the Portuguese realm. And that's why we have the Portuguese arriving into South America later on and establishing Brazil, what is today Brazil, which is a Portuguese-speaking country. Well, Spain, of course, was interested in finding precious metals, but they made their money from sugar, because sugar had become a very precious commodity that was produced only in certain areas of the Mediterranean Sea or the Mediterranean coast. But sugar was actually the model for colonizing new lands in the Caribbean, because the Spanish had established sugar plantations off the coast of Africa. And in this period of the late 15th century, early 16th century is when plantation slavery to produce sugar using African slaves begins to develop. Now, initially, the Spanish established sugar plantations in the Caribbean islands, and initially they tried to utilize the native peoples as slaves, but they died very quickly of these European diseases. And I only have a couple of minutes left here, but I want to mention John Cabot. You know about John Cabot, perhaps. He was Genoese born. He lived in Venice. He began working for the English in the late 15th century. The English were sailing out of the port of Bristol, which is in southern England, and Cabot then was an Italian with this information legacy, this heritage of mariner information, and he also was, like Columbus, getting information back from these fishermen who are going out, these cod fishermen who are going out in the North Atlantic. He eventually made it to Newfoundland, and but it's sad because Cabot had a lot of potential. He was probably a much better mariner than Columbus, but he was lost in a storm in 1498. His son, Sebastian Cabot, was working for Spain. Okay, and so this, in some ways, put a damper on the expansion of the English into the New World for a while. Unlike the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Italian city-states, the North Europeans around the time of the early 1500s were far less unified people, and so they were not. They didn't have a great impetus to move out into the rest of the world. They were largely dependent on those Mediterranean mariners in terms of foreign trade. But at this time, the British and the Northern Europeans, the Dutch, began a rivalry with one another that would later take us into the 16th century. And so I'm going to stop there. We're out of time, and you will have some reading about this. It's coming at you, and next time we will begin talking about the other groups that will begin colonization. Any questions today? You all have been wonderfully patient with me. So have a great weekend. We will not meet tomorrow. I may have a recording for you tomorrow, but tomorrow is Thursday. We normally will have a discussion on Thursday, but we won't tomorrow. And then Monday is a holiday. So our next online discussion, live discussion, will be on Tuesday of next week, which I believe is September 8th, something like that. So until then, farewell and happy reading. Stay healthy.